This is Ephraim the Wise. Ephraim is a wizard. All throughout Ephraim's story, he rises above all challenges with his trusty magic. Being a wise master, he knows exactly what spell to use to solve the problem. In the end, he saves the princess, bests the dragon, and lives happily ever after. Ephraim sucks. Let's explore why and talk about fantasy, magic, and superpowers. I'm author DC Fergerson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. Before we get started, I want to give you all a quick reminder. Subscribers to my newsletter are getting a copy of Cora Blake, Arcane Agent for free. This short story is a prequel to the Dragon's Dream saga and a great chance to get started with the series. I link the newsletter sign up in the comments. Make sure to sign up and get your free copy. While you're at it, you beautiful person you, why don't you like me on Facebook? We'll make a blanket for it. We'll be best friends. And you get to see what I'm up to, get my books from the store, and all sorts of cool stuff. We've talked about this topic before, but nothing is more important to having a believable, enjoyable fantasy world than this. Too often, we can fall in the traps and tropes of lesser fantasy worlds that flood the market when the genre gets too hot. It's tragic, really, because some of these "hey, me too" kind of movies and books that pop up and try to cash in can actually be fun popcorn entertainment, but they'll fall apart under any critical examination. Honestly, I hate it when that happens, and I'm not immune. Many times I've walked out of a theater or closed the last page on a book and I thought it was alright, only to see it get trashed in reviews. Then I actually look at the reviews and say, oh yeah, that part didn't really make much sense, or something to that effect, and it lessens my enjoyment of the original experience. I'm not saying that our every move as writers is to try and create timeless classics, but wouldn't that be nice? So, we're going to talk about magic systems and superpowers again today. But DC, you're leaving out technology. Ah, guy who talks to your monitor. That is a good observation. This week, we're handling fantasy and magic. Next week, we're going to go into sci-fi and technology. Why the split when they're so obviously related? Well, the main reason is that this is such a big topic, and a good portion of what we're going to be talking about today won't apply to technology, and vice versa. Not only are we going to talk about the how, but it's also important to understand the why. There's one major problem with both magic and technology that makes this topic worth revisiting, and that's the giant truck that it's driving at your story. If your plot gets anywhere near it, you best believe that truck is going to go through it with a mind of its own, like we're stuck in maximum overdrive. Yeah, baby. How's that for a deep cut? Anyway, we need to avoid plot holes and continuity errors. Magic is the one part of our world building with the highest chances to create those. Now, fair warning, I'm never above a shameless promotion, but I'm going to be using myself a lot today to illustrate how I personally have handled the problem of each topic we're tackling. For consistency's sake, it would be weird to keep switching between various fantasy worlds to illustrate a point, because these are all interconnected. And hey, if you haven't read the Dragon's Dream saga by now, I don't even know what you're waiting for. It's free on Kindle Unlimited, so yeah, go read that. As we've said, we've wrangled this beast before, and we're doing it again. We want all our cards on the table. So let's start with a checklist. What does this magic or power do? How do you get it? Where are the limits of it? Who can use it? And when did it come to be? And why does it exist? So let's dig deep. Knowing what the power can or can't do is basic, but you need to know. Remember our wonder scale. The less it's explained, the less useful it can be. Why is that? Well, when magic comes from thin air and becomes a Swiss Army knife for the hero to break out of whenever they're having a problem with, it's less a power and more a plot device, or just outright Deus Ex Machina. We want to avoid her at all costs because she's kind of scary. Even if you have a great idea in your mind of how the power works, if it never finds its way into the dialogue or narrative of your story, it's still going to look contrived regardless. So, remember, we don't only want to know what the power is, but we want to be able to explain it as well. Next up, how does your hero get this power? Can just anyone find this amulet in the ground and be a great wizard, or does it take years of training? We know from discussions on the hero archetype that your protagonist is someone special, and that's awesome. But could it have been someone else? How hard was it? The whole concept of the chosen one is a cliche-laden minefield. How you subvert this is up to you, but your explanation needs to pay off. The most problematic part of the basics is next, and that's the limitations. You've heard me talk before about the Green Lantern problem. For those of you tuning in for the first time, I love me some Green Lantern, but I'm the first in line to have a laundry list of problems with his powers. So, here's why. Green Lantern's two primary limitations aren't limitations at all. His ring can craft anything that he can imagine, and he needs to have it recharged every 24 hours. Let's start with the first one, the power itself. Human imagination is not a limitation at all. If anything, it broadens his powers to be godlike in scope. The secondary problem is the recharge. The recharge conundrum is dependent on what the writer needs it to be at the time. So, in one story he runs out of a charge at the worst possible time for drama's sake, while on the other hand he can fly into deep space fighting aliens for however long until the writer decides to impact him with the limitation, again, for drama's sake. On paper, Green Lantern should be more powerful than Superman, the most godlike figure in the DC's universe. Why he can't imagine chains so strong that Superman couldn't break free of them? Why can't he imagine that the ring can make him fly faster than the Flash? And if he could do these things, why can't he wrap up every fight with every villain within 5 minutes or less? The last one we'll get to later, because believe me, the ramifications of your chosen magic or power is so vital it needs its own section. So, when we're looking for limitations, we need real, concrete, you can't do this kind of stuff in the mix there. And why you can't is just as important as the power itself. It's the yin to its yang, and we love us some balance. So, who can use this power and when it came to be are simple enough to understand. We need to know how this power is open. Is it open to everybody or just the hero? Look at the Marvel movies. So many of them use a hero with one power and their villain ends up with an identical power. Is this power open to just these two guys, or is the power open to anyone that learns magic or decides to inject themselves with a radioactive isotope? When it came to be is also important. Was the magic always there in your world? Where did it come from? Is this power based on a freak occurrence like Spider-Man, with a 1 in a billion shot to have granted powers while it would have killed anyone else? This goes hand in hand with why the power came to be, and you want to know this stuff as you get into it. Now that we've covered the basics, let's see it in action. This is how I handled the problem myself. Keep in mind, these decisions I made for how my world works in Book 1, I am still bound to writing Book 6 like I am now. Anything else would be a retcon, so make sure this is something that works for you and your stories, or you're going to paint yourself into a corner down the road. Alright, so I got my piece of paper and my trusty pen and I'm off. Project Phoenix Book 1 establishes that magic has been with us on Earth this whole time. In 2058, the Third Awakening began. This was marked by the return of dragons, fairies, and magical races to the world, as well as magic itself that moves in and out like tides. The last time it was here was just prior to the Dark Ages. So, that answers the when and the why. Now, when the Awakening took place, 3% of the world's population returned to their native magical form. So people transformed into elves, trolls, and dwarves, and a group of people called natives. This change happened overnight. Our main character is Cora Blake, a Native American girl born in the year of the Awakening. As a native, she is naturally magically inclined. This now answers the who and the how, as all natives, some elves and some humans, are capable of using magic. Cora's powers are abnormally strong, but the magic is primarily based on energy she manifests. So, she can do things natural, like using created wind under her feet to slow a big fall, or power her legs to jump higher. She can also do things supernatural, like a ball of concussive energy that explodes when it hits something and acts like a grenade, or creating an energy shield that blocks fire. This covers what the magic does. Okay, so what are the limitations? She cannot heal with magic. She cannot use the power for any kind of healing of herself or others. She can only use the power to blind her senses to pain, but the damage is still there. Cora also has a separate, unrelated ability to regenerate for that, but that's not really important for this part. Cora also cannot raise the dead back to life. What she can do is raise bodies back to life without their souls, effectively wielding an army of zombies. This is a power that absolutely terrifies her. but that we'll get into again when we talk about ramifications. Now, these two limitations that I'm mentioning are going to be really important later, so I want you to keep that in mind. That, for now, covers our examination of the basics. You don't think we're done, right? We need to build on this. Get back here. I would strongly recommend that the very first thing you do after nailing down your powers or magic is go back into your world building mode. You want to examine the ramifications of what you've created, not just on your character, but at every stage of the game. How did this power affect your protagonist, their town, their region? If they're part of a religion, that too. If the power is widespread, then how does its existence affect the whole world? For these answers, we're using two things: the world as we've known it, and a good bit of common sense. It's not enough to say, my high fantasy setting is a lot like the Middle Ages, but with wizards casting fireballs. That one addition of magic is so much grander than you give it credit for. The ripple effects of its very existence means your world will not unfold like ours did. I've used this example before, but again, think about it. If you have a rare power, let's say magical healing, it can bring people back from the dead, close grievous wounds, even regenerate lost limbs. We make it so rare that only 1 in 10,000 healers have this power. That seems low, right? Well, there were 200,000 people in 1600 in London alone. That means that 20 people just in London had this power to make it so that never anyone died of a plague, infections, botched surgeries, or accidents. The infant mortality rate would have been shockingly low, and we'd be living on a planet by now of double the population that we're at right now. That's a real ripple, and one you can't underestimate. In large part, we're trying to take our when from the basics that we wrote down and extrapolate it to where the story takes place. Obviously, the closer to when to where your story takes place, the less society as a whole has to react to it. So, for example, with the first Iron Man movie, billionaire defense contractor Tony Stark makes a tactical suit capable of being an army unto itself. It's the first of its kind, so we begin to see the first effects of his ripple on the world in real time through the course of the story. However, if magic has always existed on your world, then there has to be centuries of alternate history of how that power has shaped the world to account for it. Now, I gave myself a gigantic burden of saying that both magic has always existed and my story takes place on our Earth. So the first thing that I needed to do was to find ways to hide our modern knowledge of its existence here in 2020, and then account for how the world changes when it reappears in 2058 for a story that takes place in 2082, 24 years after the fact. This is such a juggling act I cannot even begin to describe it to you. If I was ever actually tasked with writing out a Bible to my world's history and explaining how all this happened, I'd be writing an entire extra book of facts, figures, and history. So, let's start with the quote-unquote easy part, the historical aspect. Our world's history is literally filled with legends and fables, tales of magic swords and stones, and fairies in the wild. Basically, I made it so that the vast majority of that was real. A guiding force called the Illuminati were created by the wizard Merlin to selectively remove records of our magical history from the masses to control the flow of information. Arguably, this got both easier and harder as time went on, but with so much of our historical records prior to the Dark Ages missing or incomplete, it's easy to say that the Illuminati did our job well. We now just pretty much blame it as myth and legend. Now, the future is basically whatever I want to make of it as a writer, so you'd think I'd have the most creative freedom here. The thing is, though, we live in a very connected world in an age of instant information, memes, and worldwide communication to anyone we want, anywhere, at any time. So when a dragon pops out of a mountain in Scotland in 2056 and tells us in about 2 years magic is going to return and cause an upheaval of everything we've ever known, what comes next is really important. It has to feel believable. The way I approach this is the same as humans have always approached any massive change, with violence and an every man for himself style rioting. That may sound cynical, but history kind of backs me up on this. So, places with incredible diversity would see the most amount of change. As such, America devolved into a second civil war, as the native people that were awakened possessed magic, a power so terrifying that the United States sought to either oppress it or eradicate it. The sudden appearance of elves, dwarves, and trolls also made the southern states yearn for the traditional and simpler times when we were all just human. States that didn't want to participate in the war took the chance to secede from the Union, and so the Florida, Texas, and California Free States were born. In the end, the remnants of the country split in three, with the native people in the Midwest out to Nevada, and the United Northern States in the Southern Confederacy split up the eastern half. Countries more homogenous, like Germany, were quick to embrace the herald of this new age, and the dragon Lucius, the CEO of the world's largest cybernetics corporation, basically becomes the de facto ruler of the EU. All of this societal tension finds its way into as much of the narrative as I can possibly pepper it in. Whether it's fairies working as waitresses to try and make ends meet in the New World, or dwarves feeling like they're regarded as second-class citizens in Germany. I'm trying to illustrate that the world has shifted, but the more it changed, the more the problems stayed the same. So it's both alien and fantastic while still being grounded and believable, which is exactly what my aim was. Magic returning to the world was one thing, but those that can wield it is another. They're mostly imagined as living weapons, and the governments of every country want to scoop up and employ as many of them as they can, like a new kind of Cold War. And that drops us off at the doorstep of Cora Blake, our protagonist. When the first book begins, we find she agreed to join the NSA about 2 years prior for a very lucrative short-term contract. This is what I'm talking about here. We want to take the point where the power began in your world and where the story takes place, and then build a bridge in between them, filled with alternate history for your world. It doesn't even have to be details the reader knows. For example, I might have it in my head that tensions in Russia have made them isolationist, but they still appreciate all of their own transformed people. Well, unless I go to Russia in the books, or have a Russian discussing what life is like there, it's never going to be important. However, when that day comes that I do introduce a Russian character, you better believe this detail is going in to inform what this character is like and how he feels about his homeland. It may even affect how my characters can even get to meet this Russian to begin with. So these tidbits are good to know. Perhaps now you can understand why I refer to this as such a juggling act. A global future world has the same 150 plus countries we have now, give or take, and they all reacted in their own way to this new magic. Now, I explained all of that just to illustrate how involved this part gets. If you don't think it through, or don't think you need to, trust me, either your story will suffer for a lack of it, or you'll suffer from a world that doesn't feel real. So, now we've got our powers. We know how it works in the world. We know our limitations. Well, we still have a story to tell. If we were just talking about the macro impacts on your world last section, then now we're discussing the micro impact, that of the characters in your story. So, since we're talking about impacts, let's start with the obvious. What's it like to be the person with this power? What's it like to be a friend to someone who just got this power? The interpersonal relationships among your cast of characters is going to alter and grow along this axis, so keep that in mind. If your goal is to have your hero get their power, pick up a hero's sword, and go on a hero's quest with a hero's ally, you're telling a fairy tale, and at that, a really boring one. So, what makes me love your character is who they are, at their best and their worst. This is displayed through everything related to their power, but also how they treat other people in dialogue. These relationships aren't necessarily related to the magic directly, but you better believe that magic is definitely going to relate to them. The other impact we want to discuss is your limitation. Believe me when I tell you this isn't your hero's weakness or yours. This is the single greatest strength you have for evoking emotion and sympathy and making your journey feel fraught with danger. What do I mean by that? Well, let's go right into examples about what we've been talking about. So let's start with relationships again. In the Dragon's Dream saga, Cora is a passionate, loving person. All of the negativity in her life and all the people she's lost have made it so that she treasures everyone she cares for. But that same negativity dogs her personal life. She's an alcoholic, the only coping mechanism she's ever known for the constant stress and nightmares she deals with. She's also so protective over these friends that she'll often throw herself into danger instead of working as a team. If she can take the hit over the chance of losing a friend, it's no choice to her at all. This makes her endearing, a true friend to the end, but also deeply flawed. This multifaceted nature, this double-edged sword of her personality, dramatically affects her relationships, doubly so with magic involved. Now, I've told you that, so let's talk about the limitation. As I mentioned earlier, Korra's magic cannot heal, and it cannot bring back the dead. It's hinted at in Book 1, but in Book 2 we start to see that Korra is prophesized for a showdown with the dragon Lucius. Until that fated day, she's basically unkillable. Her regeneration makes that doubly so. But, DC, that sounds like you've painted yourself into a corner. There's no stakes if she can't die. Well, guy who talks to your monitor, that's a very astute, critical thinking right there. And if that's the case, then how did I subvert the lack of stakes when I basically have a Supergirl that's the love child of Doctor Strange and Wolverine? Well, honestly, I'd approach it the same way I'd write Superman. Korra is always promised tomorrow. Not a single other person in her life is given that promise. Between the prophesized day and now, she can't die. But her relationship, these people that she loves and cares for, are open game. This is her real Achilles heel, and this is the axis I can torture her on. I know it sounds grotesque, but this is what you want in a limitation. Death is easy, painless, and a sudden end. If you want real emotion, you want real stakes, you have to find that fate worse than death, that limitation that all these powers can't fix, and then step on it. We want our characters to suffer, okay? These are trials that great heroes are built upon. As you can see, I've got a lot to talk about on this subject, but fear not. We'll be back next week talking about the flip side of this coin, covering tech and sci-fi. Magic and technology is still my single most viewed episode on YouTube, and that one only scratched the surface. Next week, we're going to take another deep dive into the powers that drive our moon men. Once again, the donations from you guys are so awesome, and I thank you so much. We're still working with the Boston-based Needs organization to get this beautiful lady a service dog. Her name is Liana. She's 11 and on the spectrum. This wonderful person is my little girl, and if you'd like to help out, there's a link in the comments below. Also, don't forget while you're down there to sign up for my newsletter, and you're going to get Korra Blake, Arcane Agent, totally free. You'll get cool news about what I'm working on books and here on the channel, and it comes loaded with cool authors and promotions for fantasy and sci-fi. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, I'm DC Fergerson. Now have fun and get crafting.